I do think there's some missionary to be done here, because I feel like the ground here is fertile for like a truly computational Oulipo, like a Bay Area, and it's like big data, and it's like looking at, I'm totally serious, like, yeah, looking at these like huge sort of corpuses that you can analyze and draw things out of them and generate a billion versions of some poem or some novel with like a piece of JavaScript or something. Like that seems like waiting to be grasped by our place.
As we were discussing earlier, I think right now there is no particular place for computational linguistics or the sort of thing that Robin's describing within the Oulipo, and I think that's mostly just because the members who are running things are still the members who joined really early on and are in their 70s or 80s and aren't really that jazzed about the idea of doing that. But I think it is interesting and promising that so many things can be done along these lines. In the early years of the Oulipo, so the minutes from the first 3 years of meetings are published, and every now and then some development in what then was the burgeoning field of computer science really excites everyone, really knocks everyone's socks off. Like somebody comes to a meeting at one point and says you guys, there's this research center in rural France that has the entire works of Racine and Corneille on huge punch cards. And everyone's like, oh my God, that is awesome. What can we do with that? And it's like, the excitement is really palpable because there are all these interesting manipulations that you can do, especially in that time where it wasn't so much about writing, it was more about, seeing what if you could read every poem by Baudelaire and take out every instance of a certain word or a certain syntactic configuration, and what if you could make a poem out of just those? That's an interesting thought experiment at least. But just over the years, in the late 80s, something called the Alamo was started, which was a sister group to the Oulipo involving some of the Libyans that was basically the Oulipo for computer-generated literature. And that, for reasons that I don't really fully understand, never really got off the ground. And like I was saying before, I think some of that fervor got taken up by a lot of North American poets like Kristen Book and some of the LA-based conceptual writers who are really into not so much Oulipian constraint as procedural. There's another word that I'm not thinking of. Just writing that there's a whole group called FLARF. I don't know if it's really a group, but FLARF is poetry generated by search engines, and that's the sort of thing that that's at least a provincial beachhead or a provisional beachhead in that territory to be explored.
Kind of jumping off of other kinds of Oulipo, I'm kind of curious what you can talk about as translation as a writing constraint, because kind of when you think about it, it seems like a very Oulipian exercise. Like you're given this text, and you have to render another text. It's basically that same text, but in a different language. Like write this book again, but write it in another language. And I know that some of the great Oulipians have been translators or really kind of embraced translation as an interesting challenge. I'm reminded of George Perec translated Harry Matthews' novel, The Odradek Stadium, in which kind of it's an epistolary novel. These two people are just writing letters to each other, and one of them kind of comes from this imaginary country and speaks this imaginary language, and she's writing kind of this pidgin English, this kind of half English and half her language that Harry Matthews essentially just invented for the purposes of his novel. And then Perec then had to create pidgin French based on this thing. And that just seems like a completely Oulipian exercise.
Totally, yeah.
I mean, does that come up? Is that something that they've ever considered formally as kind of an Oulipian thing?
Yeah, from time to time. I don't know that there's not like an Oulipian stance. There's not a party line on translation. You're right that a lot of members have been translators, like Perec and Matthews. Ian Monk, who's the currently active English member, got his start by translating mostly Perec. Perec's novel, Without the Letter E, has been translated by at least 3 different people into English with the same constraint. It's also been translated into Spanish without the letter A, and into German and Russian and Turkish and Dutch and like some languages that don't even have a letter E. And that's obviously in some ways much more difficult than what Brecht did, because not only do you have to work under this really arduous constraint, but you also have to keep some semblance of the story intact. And so obviously part of the key is just finding somebody for whom that's a really exciting proposition, as opposed to like the most awful burden you can imagine.
I'd like to see someone translate Peric's 5,000 word palindrome.
Yeah.
One thing that interests me is how in America, I mean, you mentioned Flarf or conceptual poetry, how, and even you can even talk about language poetry, although how much less successful those movements have been in the States than Oulipo. I would say that, I mean, put language poetry aside, conceptual poetry and Flarf have generated essentially no literary works of merit. And that is not the case for Oulipo. And I kind of think the reason is that the American versions cave in too quickly. They become didactic and they don't take it to its absurd, humorous, pleasurable conclusion like the Oulipians do. And I think that's like that's the great, again, I mean, I was saying that earlier, I just think that's the great pleasure of Oulipo for me, is how extreme it is. And I just feel like people who write these Flarf poems, they turn back so quickly. They just start with a little procedure, and then they don't carry it to its most extreme and interesting conclusions. But I don't know, maybe that's I'm not my impressions of this are very they're just based on occasional encounters with this stuff. I don't know, maybe you have a more developed view on this subject.
I mean, not really. I think my perspective on it is probably less informed than yours, but I think I would sort of speculate that the French market, so to speak, for larks like this is a little more permissive, and that you can go a little farther, you can be a little more absurd with something like writing a book without the letter E, without having to align yourself with something that's either like totally far out and avant-garde or academic, as I think has been the dichotomy, for better or for worse, with that sort of thing in English. Either you're sort of radical, poetic renegade, or you are doing something whose purpose is chiefly kind of didactic, as you say, and illustrating a certain kind of relationship to literature rather than to language.
Do you feel that's kind of a structural thing to French culture? Like, are there more outlets for these books to be taken seriously? Are there more readers for these things?
Yeah, I think so, and I can't back that up with any relevant substantiation, but I think, yeah, like, the readership is a little more prepared for whatever, and probably the publishing world is too.
Well, I think it also has to do with. Oh, I'm sorry. Good. I was going to say, I think it might also have to do with It sounds like your friends, your colleagues in the Oulipo had a discussion about branding and ultimately decided not to trademark Oulipo. Is that right? Is that what you said? Basically. Yeah. Now, that's not what would happen with conceptual poetry or with Flarf. The minute that Flarf started to happen, it immediately became a branded activity that people tried to monetize, essentially, which was so ironic for so many different reasons. And I think that is sadly the reason why Oulipo has been successful. And I think that this urge to commodify and brand one's literary output in America is what's at the heart of this failure to take it to an interesting level where of unreadable, essentially like willingness to be unreadable. You have to have that willingness, the glee in your unreadability to really do anything that's interesting, actually. You know, but again, that's my impression.
That's very Tyler Durden of you.
But at the same time, there's this thing like reading it, there's this, I felt this sort of envy or hunger, or just, I guess, the appeal of this movement and its longevity, and the scene of like one of these Thursday events, these big readings, where like in this one, this is in the first chapter of the book, the 425-seat auditorium is full, and chairs and television screens have been set up in the atrium for the runoff crowd. And then later, somewhere later, you explain how like the crowd, they all know the forms, they can like they recognize certain things, and they actually just like repeat attendance. So it's simultaneously this like extremism, but not like to the degree that you're alone in a room. Rather, it's like a stadium. I mean, it's amazing. I think they,
This is also France. It's a country, a society that would put writers and artists on its currency, and that would never happen here. I mean, it's very telling that you have Raymond Queneau, the author of Zazie and the Metro, great novel made into a fabulous film, but there's a metro stop named after him. I don't know what the equivalent would be here, a Philip K. Dick BART stop, maybe, but it wouldn't happen.
They all kind of are.
Yeah,